Right, well, a very quick and obvious question, obvious to me anyway. If you have this movement developing in South Africa that was outside the ANC, what are the political forces that could actually take the leading position in those movements? I mean, in the talk we heard a lot about the trade unions. Is there an alternative force that could replace the ANC as the government of South Africa, or indeed is there some sort of a force that could be some kind of revolutionary force, or are we light years away from that?
And it's just a point of clarification. You mentioned the delivery protests from 2005 onwards. I mean, you didn't. I may have missed it, but I didn't get any expansion on what you were referring to, delivery protests. Just that.
I've got a question. I'm not even sure quite how to formulate it. It takes us back to the struggle against apartheid itself, because one of the things which seems to have characterised the end of apartheid is a process which is repeated, which repeats something that happened elsewhere. It happened in Eastern Europe. It happened in Latin America in the 1980s. It happened in Spain in 1976, which is an old, essentially a very highly authoritarian regime, faces the need to make concessions, and then has to engage in some kind of looking for somebody with whom it can negotiate, against a background, in the case of South Africa in particular, where there's mass militant opposition, and which presents a problem for any transition which is going to be managed. And that seems to me essential. In a way, to talk about South Africa today, we have to understand that past and how that was carried through. The round table process, as it was called in Poland or Hungary, for example, or I've forgotten what the term was for the Pact of Moncloa, I think it was in Spain. There were a whole number of these processes, and they're part of the pattern of the way that revolutions have been carried out in the period from the 1970s through to certainly to 1994. I think it's less apparent that pattern is still continuing, but there was a period when that was the pattern of managed transitions, they were called. The political scientists had various terms for these events, and they had a whole language which they developed. And I wonder if you can relate what happened in South Africa also to that larger pattern and picture. Not so much about South Africa today, but actually looking at the fall of apartheid as itself part of the processes we're trying to understand in relation to revolution in the present period.
I want first of all to thank Claire for a really brilliant and illuminating talk that makes it much easier to understand the very exciting developments that are taking place in South Africa today. What I want to talk about relates to some extent to the question that Colin was answering, because here, I mean, what we have in South Africa is a thoroughly bourgeois government, closely integrated in a powerful capitalist class that has, as Claire said, been quite successful as part of the series of deals in the 1990s in shifting most of the big companies have now shifted their at least legal headquarters to London, but continue to dominate and to derive the bulk of their profits from South Africa itself. But this government presiding over what is still the strongest capitalist economy in South Africa has a fantastically powerful card, which is that it only got to that negotiating table through the most intense mass struggles. And that functions at two levels. First, in terms of general legitimacy. So Zuma is, proving to be an even worse president than Thabo Mbeki, but Zuma is still capable of trying to show his his struggle cred by dancing and singing this song about "Bring Me My Submachine Gun," referring to his time as one of the commanders of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC. But secondly, and more crucially, there's the Congress Alliance and the presence of both the Communist Party and COSATU within that alliance, which means that the organised grip of this government reaches deep into the workplaces and the townships. And when Colin talks about the other negotiated transitions, I think there's one important difference, which is the intensity of the material pressures on the mass of South Africans are on a scale that's radically different from whatever we say about what's happening in Spain, for example, radically different from the pressures that have been felt in Spain over the last 20 or 30 years. So, contrast, Santiago Carrillo, the leader of the Spanish Communist Party, critical person in the negotiated transition in Spain, died the other day. People said the obituary said he was a crucial figure in the transition, but then he was very rapidly marginalised. The South African Communist Party played a crucial role in the transition, is not at all marginalised, and that's because of the continual material pressures and in everyday life. We're talking about a society where something like 40% of the population are unemployed. Unemployment has increased significantly since the end of apartheid. The rate of growth has been very slow, so the accumulation of poverty has grown on an even greater scale than it did under apartheid, and that produces massive struggles. There's a group of South African social scientists with whom Claire associated have produced figures which claim to show that South Africa has more cases of mass struggle than anywhere else in the world. Maybe a slightly biased measure, but they're massive struggles, the strikes that Claire was talking about and so on. But the Congress Alliance has acted as a fantastic shock absorber and has been able, in more or less successfully, to contain the discontent within its political framework. So the far left in South Africa is unfortunately still a very marginal force. Now the situation is changing. Now, I mean, this is the first real break in the dominance of the alliance that we've seen with the Marikana strike. I mean, personally, I think what this is likely to immediately benefit is not the revolutionary left, but a more Africanist and militant populist nationalism than that of the dominant one of the ANC. There's a very interesting film on YouTube of the victory rally of the Marikana strikers, which is interesting because it's absolutely massive. So anyone who says these are a bunch of imperialist lackeys are kidding themselves. But the General Secretary of ANCU speaks, and it's very militant. It's expressed in progressive terms. He talks, for example, about overcoming tribal differences and maintaining broad unity, but it's expressed, I think, in Africanist terms. The problem is that we have an economy that is dominated by foreigners. What we want is for Africans to be in control, which dovetails very much in with the kind of things that Malema is saying. So I think this may be a moment at which there's a real break in the hegemony of the Congress Alliance. It won't necessarily favour genuine socialist politics in the short term, but there are real possibilities to build a much stronger anti-capitalist left in South Africa if people are able to relate to what is, I think, quite a fast-moving situation.
Hi, it's really a question following on from what Alex has just said. Really, yes, the Congress Alliance has functioned as a shock absorber, but given the fact that post-1994 South Africa has seen the accumulation of poverty that Alex was talking about, how comes the Congress Alliance has been able to function as a shock absorber for so long? Is it simply the fact that the ANC the South African Communist Party, and then later COSATU, were able to basically rest on the historical laurels of that? Or was there some other element? I mean, I'm just thinking back, in a sense, to us in Britain in the 1960s and 1970s, when essentially the Labour Party and the Communist Party still had cadres in most workplaces, that actually they were able to, for example, carry through the social contracts in 1976 through the fact of those links and be able to hold back much of the working class and demobilise those people who'd fought in the struggles of 72 to 74. Now, what I'm actually wondering is inside the workplaces in South Africa after 2004, 1994, I'm getting my decades mixed up, did COSATU, the South African Communist Party, and the ANC, i.e. the Congress Alliance, have the people in the workplaces that were able to put forward an argument to their members that they had to wait for change, and that, you know, the situation of the world economy was unfortunate, etc., etc., etc. In other words, how has the Congress Alliance been able to act as a buffer? Through what means?
The first thing I want to say about is about Marikana, that to think about the importance of it in a world scale. Across the world there are strikes and protests against austerity, against things being taken away from people. One of the key things about Marikana's victory is it's about the size of the increase, not about stopping something being taken away. And that's an extraordinary achievement, really, particularly because the crisis in the mineral sector is happening. The immense expansion of platinum on the basis of Chinese demand has come to an end because of the slowdown in the Chinese exports, because of the slowdown in Europe. You also think, where does platinum go? Most of it goes into the automotive industry, into exhaust systems. The automotive industry is not expanding, therefore there's a squeeze in the mineral sector. The response of workers in Marikana and the other mines is to push for more, not simply to accept what they have. Now, of course, there's still vast divergence between this incredibly profitable mineral and some of the poorest people on earth in terrible conditions digging it out in an incredibly dangerous job. But it's an extraordinary achievement to get a wage increase of 22% or 11%. It's something not seen probably since 1946 miners' strike in South Africa. It's an extraordinary achievement, and one that we should remember in all the campaigns that we're involved in at the moment. But I want to say something about the politics of it, because I think that's absolutely key. Because I think we have to understand that what the force that has held down is not single-layered, it's triple-layered. The role of the South African Communist Party is extremely important in terms of this. That what happened in 1994 and subsequently, if it were just the ANC, it would be much easier for people to see through the ANC, if you like, and to recognise the necessity for a different sort of politics. But it has three layers. It has both the ANC, it has COSATU, and it has the SACP. And the SACP plays an absolutely critical role in this. When I was in South Africa in the early 1990s, I used to go to the shop stewards meeting of NUMSA, the Metalworkers Union, in Johannesburg. 200 workers met every week, 4 groups in different languages, translating to one another. Extraordinary meetings. All the key people, nearly all the key people in that, were members of the Communist Party, carrying a line into people's workplaces. Incredibly courageous militants, but their politics were those of the Communist Party. And this is very, very important, it seems to me, because it means that you can have immense militancy, but there is a block about moving beyond that. And therefore we have to see how this process is unfolding. And there are some interesting developments. If you look at that NUMSA statement that Claire mentioned, it's not just about Marikana. It goes in, it says what happened in 1994, it goes through it, and it says, what we achieved, therefore, in 1994 was empty political power without economic power. That's a fairly damning indictment of what happened in 1994. It's very similar to what we'd say about it. I mean, actually, probably go further than what I'd say. Empty political power is quite a big thing. So at the end of Apartheid, it was not really simply an empty occurrence. It's a fantastic victory against racism and against a ruthless state. Nonetheless, it's very clear about that. Then it says, what are we going to do? We're going to win back the Communist Party. The Communist Party cannot be taken from us. We are revolutionaries. We are going to take back the Communist Party. So it's still framed in that way, but nonetheless it's a very radical feel about this. And I think what Marikana has opened up is this sense of the gap between the ANC and the population. If you look at the voting figures for the ANC, they keep going down, particularly amongst younger people, people who don't situate their politics simply in the transition from apartheid to today. They see it as, you know, what is our lives like? Joblessness, there's poverty, there's lack of anything. That is very, very important, it seems to me, that Marikana can kick that process much further onwards. And one of the demands, I think, will be the demand around nationalisation, which is an extremely important demand that's emerged, both in the minds and more broadly in South African society. Because it begins, people say we must implement the Freedom Charter of 1955 fully. In 55, the ANC, the Congress of the Peoples, said mineral wealth belongs to all South Africans. That means nationalisation. It doesn't mean some multinational having it. And therefore you can still be situated in the ANC, COSATU, SACP tradition, but have this very radical demand that tears at the control of the economy by a small elite, whether it be multinationals or by big businessmen who happen to be Africans and happen to be members of the ANC. And therefore this is a very radical sort of demand. The other thing which I think has been raised by Marikana is the bringing together of the community protest, the delivery protest, the demands over housing, over health, over the conditions in which people live in the townships, the appalling conditions in which they live, showing that the spine that can win these things is working class organisation. Because they didn't get crushed. They were shot, they were brutalised, they were beaten, they were intimidated, they were attacked, and they won. And that's an extraordinary lesson. And if you look at Abalali Basmondjola, the biggest organised community organisation in KwaZulu-Natal, up to now it's always been overtly anti-political. We want nothing to do with politics. There's a sort of autonomous politics at the centre of it. If you look at it over Marikana, it has to say political things. It has to begin to connect with this debate about it's not enough simply to protest, we also have to talk politically about what sort of society in which we live. And therefore one of the potentials, and I don't think it will happen automatically because Alex is right about the weakness of the revolutionary left and so on, one of the potentials is that this puts foursquare a demand for people to face this political question at the heart of when they're talking about protests, and therefore not simply strikes, not simply the burning tyres and the blockades, but also politically how to replace the ANC.
I want to pick up on a question that, a phrase that Claire used, this term passive expectation, period of passive expectation, which certainly echoes a bit for me. And my question really is to ask, how has the development in South Africa been shaped by the global context, which for us has been the neoliberalism which we identified, putting crudely, with New Labour, the years of disappointment as economic growth failed to actually really do much for most people. Inequality continued to rise, and then the crash of 2007 and 8 and the impact ideologically of the disillusionment and the failure, of a global system which, clearly hadn't got an answer to how it was going to get out of the problems. And my question is therefore, how does that impact on what's happened in South Africa? To what extent can you say that there is a crisis of the settlement of 1994, given that it was based on the idea of the market, which has now globally got difficulties and has had difficulties for the last few years, which have a huge ideological impact. We see this very much in this country. What about the impact in South Africa?
Okay, just quickly on the question of clarity about what the delivery protests are. They were mainly struggles around issues of housing, electricity, water, and toilet was actually the one that sparked off the first big protest in 2005. And they were dubbed delivery protests because this was the rhetoric with the new government, was that they were going to deliver to the people. And so people turned that around, saying, where's the delivery you promised us? So it came along with a whole lot of government speak. That it became delivery to the masses. And that got turned around, that people were saying, where's this delivery? The issue, I mean, I think just as a kind of background about the global, the influence of the global situation, the global context, I think one of the crucial things that the crisis has meant is that there's much less wiggle room for whoever's in power to give a few crumbs to keep people quiet. They would dearly love to just roll out a whole lot of social welfare and get everyone quiet. But where would the money come from? And that's really what it comes down to, is a question of money and of, I guess also of political authority, that you don't want to be seen giving too much to people who make too much noise, because that's what's happening here and what's been happening in the actual delivery protests. For example, when Zuma first came to power, he was forced to rush around going to a number of protests to try and keep people quiet, and of course the effect of it was then to encourage other people to also protest, to say, look, if you burn things, people actually talked about it as the smoke that calls. If you burn the library, somebody's going to notice and come. And so it actually had the paradoxical effect of increasing the level of protest. So I think that's the two sides of the thing. The question, though, within that about how did they manage to keep the lid on things for so long? Okay, I think the first thing that, the first part of that background would have to be that actually there was, even though I'm standing here saying not enough has changed, on another level, the change in South Africa has been fast in terms of just lifting the repressive laws that apartheid was built on, and giving people, I don't want to even call it an illusion of some kind of freedom, because there is some kind of real freedom to no longer having to carry a pass, being legally allowed to stay in any area you like, even if you can't afford to stay in certain areas. And the fact is still that the townships are still, almost entirely black, and the rich areas are still very much, very dominated by whites and so on. But there have been real changes that came about with the end of apartheid that didn't cost very much. It also, the other thing that gave the new government a lot of space was this idea of gradualism, which had already been well established through the negotiated process, that you can't have everything at once. Revolutions are dangerous. You've got to do things slowly, and therefore it gave them this that kind of wiggle room to say, well, it's coming, but we've got to put in place the policy framework. We've got to change this and that law, that kind of thing. So that gave them a certain space where people were, okay, fine, we'll be patient. We fought apartheid for 50 years. We can wait another few years until things come together. So that gave them a space that's now running out. And part of that is exactly what Alex mentioned about, or Charlie, about a new generation that's not coming out of that same struggle, but is coming to the world saying, my problem is here and now, and what am I going to do about a 40% unemployment rate? But of course the other side of that was that the alliance wasn't, I presented it as and it is very much a mechanism of containment, but that's not the whole of the story. One of the ways that it contained things was also by being a valve for the pressure that COSATU did do a number of quite important one-day strikes, for example, where the idea was that the main way to change things is by influencing government and government policy, but maybe occasionally we'll have to put a little bit of pressure on them. So that also helped to keep alive the idea that somehow this was still a militant way of doing things for those forces. This is obviously getting more and more, and again, this is part of the paradox of how the containment breaks down, is that people more and more start to take these things seriously, and so, well, actually, what we're learning is we're going to have to put up the pressure, so it's always been the combination of the what during the negotiations we called it turning the tap on and off. You trot out mass action to break a logjam, and then you put it back in the box. But more and more people are starting to say, well, we need more of this kind of action. But of course, the other very important thing in that containment has to be also the absence of a real alternative. And I think we can't really underestimate this, and that was both on an ideological level, related partly to the collapse of the Soviet Union, related also very much to the fact that the alternative political parties in elections are all associated with apartheid or otherwise very small and meaningless. So the main challenge to the ANC electorally at the moment is the Democratic Alliance, which was formed as a kind of rump of the old National Party plus what was called the PFP, which was a white liberal party in apartheid, and it's taken them a long time to get out from under that cloud of still being associated with apartheid, and they've only really managed to do it by relating to coloured voters in the Cape who feel that they are not white enough for the old South Africa and not black enough for the new South Africa. So they played up on that kind of thing to build themselves a base, but obviously they're still, even though they are getting, more and more people are saying anything but the ANC. And those who are still looking to vote in might be looking more and more to the DA, but they've still got a lot of discredited past to deal with. So it seems to me, in terms of the political forces and what are the alternatives, I think that point is absolutely key, that the first alternative is not going to be just going straight to a revolutionary one. It's not like there's been no attempts. And of course it's quite strange to myself that I didn't even think of mentioning the anti-privatization forum and the social movements, but in fact, when those first began in the early 2000s, we felt like that was the first crack in the monolith in the ANC, and in one sense it was. It was the first time that people, but a very, very small number of people, were starting to stand up and say, we need to keep on fighting. The great limit of that movement, it formed largely around what we would call bread and butter issues, the issues of how to stay alive, how to pay the rent, and so on. And therefore it also became very much a movement of poor people and a movement of unemployed and pensioners. And the nut that it never quite managed to crack, and there were also ideological reasons for this again, to do with the kind of left forces that were involved in it. The nut that it never managed to crack was actually to start relating consistently to COSATU members and to ANC members on the ground, and to start actually putting forward practical ways of saying we can work together even if we disagree. And that was partly because people made a fetish out of the alliance, that they wanted to say before any struggle can happen you have to break the alliance, and what we've seen here is that that's not at all the case. Actually the breaking of the alliance had to happen more organically, in a sense, or is developing more organically. But really at the moment the kind of left forces that are significant, there is a growing Africanist challenge. That's one thing that I think is key to realise. And that will take the form, I think that will first focus largely around Malema, although some people are suspicious of him because of allegations of corruption, the fact that he does wear a fancy watch and a suit, and people feel that they've seen this all before. At the same time, he has, I think, re-established some credibility with his intervention with the miners. And therefore, the very small left forces like the Democratic Left Front, which is an attempt at some kind of a left recruitment, I think are only going to be able to grow really by relating to that kind of a bigger movement that we're likely to see, and by being part of a recruitment of that sort that comes up, I think, around those. It will be around issues, I think, crucially of economic liberation, but I think really that is quite a step forward for us to be able to put things in those terms, that the thing that is still missing is economic liberation, but having to bring into that, I think also that is intimately connected with a different kind of political liberation, a different concept of power.
I wanted to raise the question of AIDS, because I know there have been a lot of controversy about what causes it and how to fight it, and I know things have improved a bit in South Africa over that, but also, I mean, I'd like to know a bit more about what's being done about it, because I went on a holiday to South Africa about 4 years ago, and we were taken to a place that was part of a scheme that looks after orphan children, there are thousands of them in South Africa whose parents have died of AIDS and who need some kind of support. I don't know whether that's still, whether there's enough support being given to them. And just before I go down, I'd like to express my appreciation for the Archbishop refusing to sit with Tony Blair.
Can I raise a question about classification of events, which I thought I was clear about, but now I find I'm quite confused about, and this takes us back perhaps to the issues raised by Neil yesterday, in the sense that how do we classify as a historical event the transition from apartheid to ANC rule. Claire has talked about it in what seems to me potentially two different ways. One as the last of a series of national liberation struggles in Africa and elsewhere. So a moment of national liberation. Secondly, she has talked about it in using the language of permanent revolution and deflected permanent revolution. Now, whether those two sit totally side by side with each other or in congruence with each other is one issue I want to raise. And Neil's contribution yesterday seemed to me to suggest that perhaps they didn't. In what sense is a national liberation revolution a bourgeois revolution? And in my mind, I've tended to see them in that way, in the language of permanent revolution and deflected permanent revolution encourages us to see them that way, but Neil questioned that yesterday, and now, since he raised it, I find myself wondering whether he isn't onto something in questioning that. And then thirdly, Colin spoke, putting the South African experience in a category which included the transition from Francoism to democracy in Spain and allusions to Latin America, a transition from some kind of authoritarian government ruled by the military or whatever, which seems to me a totally different kind of thing, which may have parallels, but seems to me it doesn't belong in the same category at all. So these things are running around in my head, and it seems to me that what the first debate yesterday was about was trying to classify those things, but I'm not sure we've got any further in that process. I'd like some help.
Well, I'll try and help, although I should say I wasn't expecting the first session yesterday to be a debate about permanent revolution, and I would have prepared a somewhat different introduction if I'd known of that. But that's a side issue. I think it's first of all crucial to understand that South Africa, that we have emerging in the first half of the 20th century, a capitalist state in South Africa where the dominant class is centred in South Africa itself. You see the emergence of mining capitalism at the end of the 19th century, based from very early on, as Claire said, on the migrant labour system. You see after the unification of South Africa under British dominance, you see the restructuring of the South African state and society along capitalist lines that functions in the interests of a capitalist class that initially is based upon the mining houses, who have international connections but are increasingly centred on South Africa, but expands to involve a broader capitalist class, including one based in manufacturing industry, and including, as time goes on, stronger and stronger Afrikaner elements. The critical thing, though, is that this is a form of capitalism that is based upon the systematic national oppression of the black majority. And this is what opens up a perspective of permanent revolution in South Africa, because although it's a capitalist society, it's a capitalist society in which because of the oppression of the majority, generates mass struggle after mass struggle whose focus is on democratic demands. But because it's the most capitalist, industrialized society in South Africa, it's one where, as the base of the economy comes more and more to rest on black labour, not just in the mines, but in manufacturing industry, you get the role of the South African class as the central agent of change becomes more and more visible. And this is absolutely central in the 1980s, and as Trotsky predicted, in that situation, you get a workers' movement that fights around democratic demands, but also raises socialist demands. So when Charlie was talking about Nomsa shock stewards in the early 1990s, that's the example of a union that was then, and interestingly continues to be, pervaded by socialist slogans and elements of Marxist political vocabulary. So you have in South Africa exactly what Trotsky talked about when he talked about socialist revolution, which is a fusion of socialist and democratic demands. But as my old friend and comrade Colin Sparks always used to argue, permanent revolution is a theory of alternatives. In other words, if the working class constitutes itself as an independent agent of change, then there's the possibility of socialist revolution. If it doesn't, then a whole set of less attractive possibilities open up. And it's the less attractive range of possibilities for the reason that we've been discussing in detail that become dominant in South Africa. 1994, as Claire and Charlie have said, represents a partial resolution of the demands of the national liberation struggle, crucially through the establishment of democratic citizenship and the sweeping away of the apartheid laws and so on and so forth. But the structural social effects of the racial oppression of the majority make themselves felt in the very stark divisions between rich and poor, which continue to be predominantly, as has already been said, on racial lines. So, this is why, as I was saying, the leader of the AMCU justifies the strike in a political language that is Africanist, which in other words reflects the idea that the tasks of national liberation, to use a slightly problematic language, haven't been completely overcome. And what this shows is the kind of fusion of democratic and socialist demands that are characteristic of of permanent revolution are still in play in South Africa today. And this underlines why it's so important to not give up the perspective of permanent revolution and the kind of analytical apparatus that Trotsky developed to articulate that perspective, to understand what's happening in South Africa today.
I just wanted to ask a little bit more, to explore a little bit more what's meant by this idea of an Africanist element. I mean, it strikes me, if we look at what's actually happening globally, then we appear to be at an impasse in that one projection of the future is that it's a future of second-rate capitalism. That seems to be the political agenda that's dominated, because if you think about it, what we have is a situation where the existing system clearly isn't working. We have a situation also where it seems that most of the world's major economists are in opposition to what's happening, more or less radical. But we also have a situation where it keeps being, the same things keep being done over and over again. And there are two obvious explanations for that. One is that there's a lack of an organisational base for opposition in terms of trade unionism, social democracy, which existed in the past. The second is that neoliberalism, to some extent, second-rate neoliberalism, if you like, has captured the institutions. You know, it runs the civil service, it runs the banking systems, and so on and so forth. So the question arises of how do you actually break that impasse? And for me, that actually has a particularly interesting African inflection. I don't meet many South Africans, but I meet quite a lot of people from West Africa and places like that. And what strikes me, they come to my pretty low-ranked university and so forth, and what strikes me is there's an interesting difference between the kind of people who came over in the 50s and 60s and the people who are coming over today. I think someone mentioned yesterday, you know, who these earlier generation of neo-colonial leaders were, and they were engineers, they were doctors and things like this. And of course, a lot of the people coming over today are coming over to acquire things called MBAs. I think that's actually quite interesting, because when I talk to these people, they are absolutely fabulous. And if you break down the initial barrier, they are prepared to talk to you about how disgusting their societies are. They're also quite interested in you talking to them about how disgusting your society is in helping their societies to be disgusting. It's quite interesting, for example, to talk to the Nigerians, who are reputably the most corrupt country in the world, and say, yeah, we appreciate that, thank you very much for giving us all of your money, and putting it in London blanks. They rather kind of warm to that kind of argument. But then you hit the problem. Because the problem is, when you say to them, what are you going to do when you go back? The answer is, nothing I can do, is it? If you can't beat them, you've got to join them. And that's essentially why I'm here, to get my MBA or what have you. And what I'm therefore interested in is to the extent to which there is within Africa, but generally, but also in South Africa, the sense, not necessarily there's a revolutionary alternative, but there's any alternative at all, other than simply bending what exists. Because the consequence of that is that it opens you up to corruption, doesn't it? The corruption not simply of the pocket, but more so the corruption of the head. I mean, in one sense, it would be nice to have people who are a bit more idealistic, but if they say, as we have done here, there is no alternative, how do you actually overcome that? Maybe a peculiarity of talking only to people from West Africa, but the sense of that vacuum, I think, is very important.
What I was actually trying to do yesterday was draw a distinction between political and social revolutions. It doesn't seem to me to be possible to talk about that without talking about permanent revolution. In fact, there would be a gigantic elephant in the room had I not talked about that. The problem, it seems to me, is that when we think about normal capitalist development, somewhere like France or Britain or America, whatever, it's actually very rare. Most capitalist countries in the world, even well in the 20th century, are characterised by military dictatorships, by Stalinist bureaucracies, by monarchies, by emperors, by all sorts of bizarre, apparently outmoded forms in the 19th century and so on, or from the early part of the 20th century. There are very few normal capitalist countries. The problem that's been interpreted by the Communist parties as being that's because they haven't completed the bourgeois revolution, or there's still tasks of the bourgeois revolution that still have to be accomplished, and so on. And therefore we have to wait, comrades, until we've accomplished those before we can go on to do anything else. Now, one of the great virtues of the theory of permanent revolution was that it actually stood against that and said, no, we don't have to wait until we've gone through all these stages to do this. We simply go to the point of socialist revolution, and that will accomplish all these things that you think are outstanding, which, by the way, aren't tasks of the bourgeois revolution. There's nothing intrinsic to establishing a capitalist state that says you can't have a monarchy or anything like that. In fact, quite a lot of places have had that. So this is the virtue of it. But the problem is that you're never going to get to a stage where you're going to have a situation where all the countries in the world are like France, or like Britain, or whatever. Because unevenness is characteristic of the system, and is always repeated, and will endlessly reproduce new countries in which you've got so-called forms of backwardness or undemocratic rule, and all the rest of it. You can see that happening even to a certain extent in Europe now, in terms of what's happening in Greece, and to a certain extent in Italy. And this is going to be normal, right? This is always going to happen. Now, it doesn't seem to me to be helpful to think about permanent revolution in every one of those cases just because there's a deviation from some kind of perceived norm of what capitalist development is like. It may be the case in South Africa this is still a relevant case. I'm not obsessed about arguing against permanent revolution in every single case, but I think we have to be quite careful about this, about seeing there as being some kind of normal method of capitalist development, some normal form of capitalist state we have to get to and the permanent revolution is a way of kind of surpassing that. So that's really what I think the debate is about. We're not going to get away from unevenness, or about backwardness, or about kind of places currently being jiggled around in terms of the overall structure of the system. The dynamics of an even combined development will produce huge revolutionary upheavals. In South Africa, this is a case in point. But then there wasn't actually a revolution in South Africa, even to the extent there was one in Egypt. And that's what the whole point about the managed negotiation of change in the elites was actually about. Despite the magnificence of the trade union movement, the extent of the struggle and all the rest of it, actually, in terms of the outcome, it wasn't actually as dramatic as we might have expected and did expect in the 1980s when we saw the big strikes, demonstrations, the armed struggle and so on. So I think, is that political revolution? Probably, I think, in the terms I was outlining yesterday, that's how I would define it. In the sense it sought a change of elites and new people coming into the top, and integration to a certain extent of the black bourgeoisie and so on. The further revolution is still to happen. If we want to call that permanent revolution, fine. I suggest I don't think I'm not bothered about labels, in a sense, if you understand where the actual dynamic is going to come from. That certainly will come from the great extent of poverty and the kind of the way in which industry has been developed in South Africa. What I think I'm trying to say is let's not get hung up on the vocabulary, which carries a whole load of historic freight, which in a certain sense doesn't apply to the world as we have today.
I don't confess to know a huge amount about South Africa, but I want to go back to the debates and discussions that I seem to remember going on in the 1980s and 1990s with the rise of the independent trade union movement in South Africa, where for a period there was a leadership, particularly in the metalworkers union, if I remember rightly, Moses Mayakusa and company, who had a concept of change in South Africa which was independent of the Communist Party and the ANC, and actually did see the need for some kind of total political and social revolution inside South Africa. And we actually tried to relate seriously to that layer of people. And we also saved the life of Moses Mayakusa at the time, because one of the first reactions of the CP and the ANC to the fact that, you know, this very important strategic union was not following the CP line over the question of how to bring about change in South Africa was to try to get him bumped off. And we managed to stop that from happening. Now, one of the things that we always used to argue at the time was that the kind of the syndicalism of the independent trade unions would not last, because either they would develop a socialist revolutionary perspective and the kind of political organisation to go with that, which would provide the kind of leadership necessary in the circumstances to carry through a socialist revolution, or they'd end up being hegemonised by the stages theory of the South African Communist Party and become subordinate to the ANC, which is unfortunately what happened. And I found it quite interesting when Claire said that actually it was the Metalworkers Union, if I remember that rightly, who came out most clearly in support of the Marikana strike, because I seem to vaguely remember a couple of years ago Moses Mayakusa suddenly having a very bad conscience about the role that he had played when he went into the ANC and so on and so forth. Now it seems to me, remembering all those debates, I don't think we could have had all those debates about the theory of permanent revolution and the idea of permanent revolution deflected. But maybe I've just lost the plot.
I think it's a problem if people are looking for a bourgeois revolution in the sense of 18th century France, because that clearly is not something that we're going to see in the modern world. I think what's important when we look at the concept of permanent revolution is to see how a process of the development and evolution of capitalism moves the target of what Trotsky called the democratic demands that are opened up in a particular period. You see, after the 18th century, you have in the 19th century a series of revolutions in which the bourgeois revolution was carried through from above. If you look at the 20th century, what you have is a process in the context of a development of world capitalism in which this process of development takes on a much more episodic and disjointed form. There are many countries in which you can't pinpoint a precise moment and say this is when the bourgeois revolution was carried through and it became a capitalist society. And I think in that context it's quite legitimate to look at, as Trotsky and Tony Cliff and other people did, as a whole series of evolving and developing democratic demands. Why I think this is a useful concept still today is that, as Trotsky said, you can have the interpenetration of different stages of development, the process of uneven and combined development, which poses what he called peculiar problems for the people, that poses a burning question for the people, which can be resolved only through a process of political revolution that involves a profound social dimension. I think that's very important because when Hal Draper talks about the distinction between political and social revolution, he's not simply talking about what's different between political and social revolution, he's talking about how a profound social dimension can be intertwined with the political. And for me, when we talk about permanent revolution in the modern world, we're talking about how these peculiar problems posed by uneven and combined development can lead to large social struggles in which the possibility of socialist transformation begins to be posed. And in that context, for me, it seems still useful today to talk about a strategy of permanent revolution, which we counterpose to the notion that you can solve these democratic tasks and that the revolution must stop at that point. For me, what's important about the concept of permanent revolution, then, is the possibility of continuity between these particular democratic tasks that are thrown up, whether it's anti-colonialism, the end of apartheid, and so on, and the possibility of that struggle continuing through to a process of socialist revolution.
Okay, just quickly, the question about the HIV/AIDS. It's an enormous problem in South Africa. There's an incredible percentage of the population that is HIV positive. Ourselves, we keep losing comrades as keep left to the disease, 30-year-old comrades. So it's a real issue. But it's another example of the power of mass mobilization, is that actually, despite all the attempts to dodge the issue, that South Africa does actually now generally provides antiretrovirals as part of a state support program as a result of the mobilizing of the treatment action campaign. You know, and it wasn't necessarily a perfect example and so on, but it has actually won something. The bigger problem, of course, is the problem of unemployment and poverty, that you can be having your antiretrovirals but still be malnourished and so on. And in fact, one of the strange contradictions is that if your CD4 count rises above a certain level, you become eligible for a state health grant. But as soon as it falls below that level, you lose that eligibility. So there's contradictions like that. Just quickly though, the question that I left out from the last round was Jeff's question about has the critique of the market come to the fore, and I think that's actually quite important in understanding what is the issue about permanent revolution and deflected permanent revolution in South Africa, is that in fact the issue of the market, it's there's a critique there, and it's been raised a lot by social movements like Anti-Privatization Forum and DLF, but also it's muted under the question of race and the end of apartheid. Okay, and that's quite an important thing to realize about one of the things that makes the situation in South Africa specific, and I don't say unique, but what makes it specific is that it doesn't simply appear, and I don't know if this happens anywhere in the world, but certainly in South Africa, the problem doesn't simply appear as a problem of capitalism versus the workers. It can appear as a problem of corruption, and it does. It can appear as a problem of external influence versus internal control, and this is the way that Malema would put it, about the economic liberation. And it can appear very much about a question of race. Have we had enough racial transformation? Are there enough black people in charge of the major companies? You know, now the few little experiments that have been done, for example, with the Aurora mine, which is owned by one of the many children of Jacob Zuma, and which is a complete disaster. It certainly shows that black capitalists are not necessarily kinder than white capitalists. Patrice Motsepe, who's one of a very entrenched black mining capitalist who actually goes back to before the end of apartheid, that he began to establish himself. He came out shortly after the Marikana massacre, when all the other mine bosses were falling over themselves, to say, actually, we are trying to be kind to our workers and we're not so bad, and we've got all this social policy. Patrice Motsepe was right there in the front saying, well, actually, we are too soft on workers, and at some point we have to harden up. and tell them that they can't always have a wage demand, just after his own company had declared 18% increase in shareholdings, which he thought was not good enough. So certainly the black capitalists aren't every bit as bad, if not worse, in some respects than white capitalists, because they claim, and when I say worse, I don't mean to say more brutal or whatever, but that they can claim a certain brotherhood, if you like, and on that basis try and claim some kind of that we're part of patriotic bourgeoisie, we're somehow on your side against white international capital, and in that sense they can be perhaps more dangerous. But the point being that if you're using the terms of the South African Communist Party, which would be the crucial contradiction, which is the one between capital and labour, is actually obscured again and again by the fact that apartheid, even though it's ended, that the legacy of it is still living with us, and that if you don't have a long history of understanding apartheid and capitalism to be linked, then this can lead you to believe that actually the main struggle at the moment is simply for black control. When Malema gets up and speaks about economic liberation, no doubt what he means in his own mind is more black people in the JSE. Of course, what people read into that is the explosive element that makes him an interesting character for us to relate to, and that is the fact that people on the ground read solving the question of race as being about we want to be as rich as the rich white people who still control most of the economy. And I suppose that's when you talk about is there an alternative, South Africa is not a poor country. I mean, platinum, the demand for platinum is dropping, but it's got with 80% of the world's platinum reserves. If they wanted to really kick up a fuss and so that's it, we're nationalising this, it's really strategically the leverage that could give you is enormous. So it's not at all the case that there is no real alternative. There's a lot that an assertive national bourgeoisie could do if they wanted to kick up a fuss. But of course, one of the points is that the sense, and I think it's actually Trotsky's phrase, where he says the national bourgeoisie will, they will be cowardly because they don't want to rock the boat so much. And in the South African case, I think you can see very clearly that this very narrow national bourgeoisie, it's not just that it doesn't want to rock the boat, but also that its bread is buttered by fitting in with international capital, by entrenching itself, as Alex pointed out, within this international capital, which is why, I don't know if people remember yesterday that I said at one stage in South Africa we flirted with the idea of a doubly deflected revolution, that it was not just that it was deflected from the needs of the working class, but also deflected from even the limited program of nationalism. And the reason we decided it wasn't an appropriate concept is because actually our point was that what the ANC was doing was completely consistent with how far nationalism can go, what nationalism is, which is really about rearranging the political forms of capital, about rearranging an international capitalist system, and the illusion of national independence that grew up throughout the 60s was very much an illusion that was allowed by the marginalization of certain of those countries, and that at the period when ANC came to power, because it was pulled back into that system, it was simply doing what any national bourgeoisie would do. The issue was that while it fitted into capitalism very, very well, there's three levels of contradiction that are becoming sharper and sharper. One of them, of course, is their own control over the system, that while they are very happy to be part of this, this international bourgeoisie, and South Africa, certainly the government plays up a lot its role as being a gateway to Africa, as being a political force for stability in this dark continent, that kind of thing. And they do really play that up, but at the same time, obviously, it's a world that's extremely unstable, where they're not really completely in control of what happens to capital. And this is an issue that, part of the Zuma, one of the few actual policies that Zuma was clear about was an idea of trying more state intervention in the economy to try and stabilize and have a bit more control over capital. Now, of course, again, it's, this is a contradictory thing for them, that they would probably get a lot more control by nationalizing, but they're never going to suggest that, because of exactly why they're scared of Malema, is because his talk about nationalization and economic liberation threatens to spark off a huge powder keg of social discontent on the ground, which will see nationalization as a far more radical thing than what they would intend. So in that sense, they're fitting right in. And of course, the other level in which the contradiction gets sharper and sharper is the fact that people still, even young people today who didn't live through apartheid, still look at the world today and say things were supposed to be different, but why is it still that you go to some areas and they're largely white and those are the rich areas? There's a significant layer of what you might call, in terms of consumptional terms, of middle-class black youth who feel that they've been excluded from the new South Africa, that there's not enough opportunities for them. And that's obviously meshing with a much larger group of extremely alienated and extremely discontented young people who are facing a lifetime of unemployment or shitty jobs, working in the local retail store as a permanent casual, if they ever get work at all. Also with the discontent of all those people who did come through apartheid, who did expect things to be different, and who are wondering, were things better before? And that, I think, just to finish off, is the key issue about is it a, you see, I actually said yes, it is a national liberation movement and it's a deflected permanent revolution. Those things are not at all contradictory in my head, and I think it's also not the last national liberation movement. Don't forget that there's still Palestine. It was the latest of the wave that swept Africa in maybe 3 phases, but certainly there are still national liberation struggles, and new ones will be created as long as capitalism survives, as far as I can see, and as long as it continues to organize itself as nations. But I think the issue is about, that's the trouble with trying to look at it in a classificatory way, rather than trying to look at it, I think people have said very correctly that it's about a process. And it's about centrally, for me in South Africa, it's centrally a question of the inability of capitalism to deliver conclusively on the democratic demand, and the entanglement, therefore, of democratic demands with more and more with social demands, and in people's heads, given the fact that apartheid was a form of capitalism. It was one of the ways that capitalism in the world established an accumulation process. So that entanglement for me is what is most important in South Africa about understanding the why the concept of permanent revolution and its deflection, and the inability to further deflect it, that I think we're starting to see at the moment. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that it's the end game and the revolution is tomorrow. I just mean that the contradiction is getting sharper and sharper all the time. The ability to put it off, to say it's actually about, to keep on saying we're somehow in the same boat, is getting less and less. And one of the effects of that, though, is not just, as we said earlier, it's not just to throw up now it's capitalism, it's socialism or barbarism, but that it can also therefore throw up new forms of nationalism, new interpretations of nationalism, and that makes it quite important, of course, for us to put forward a political alternative. And I mean, that's the last thing in terms of what I said earlier, and also left out in terms of the, that there seemed to be no alternative to the alliance and to the ANC. And I think a crucial thing about that was not just that there was no ideological alternative, but also that there was no practical alternative that was winning and that was actually delivering. So you could stand there and be an ideological alternative, but if you don't have the power to actually win something in people's lives, it doesn't mean very much unless you're a student or a middle-class person and so on. And I think that's really one of the key things about Marikana, that makes it some kind of a tipping point, some kind of a turning point. And as I say, I don't know which way it's going to go yet. but that it has finally put on the agenda that we can fight and we can win outside of these structures, outside of the alliance, and I think that has already shown that it's going to put huge pressure also on the structures of the alliance, as well as creating an alternative outside. So the possibilities of the democratic demands growing over into social demands, I think, are posed by that. It depends on what we do.